recently, the chair of the House Tax Committee announced that Republicans and legislators would be looking at tobacco appropriation bonds as a tool to balance the state's budget. If we have a shortfall coming up, multi-hundreds of millions of dollars, Republican leader in the legislature said that certainly people will be looking at using the appropriation bonds, the tobacco bonds, to solve the deficit. And we are gathering today to tell you that, that Democrats in the State House are absolutely not okay with that solution, that we reject any idea of using appropriation bonds to solve any more state budget deficits. And we call on Republicans to finally take the responsibility to resolve the budget deficit honestly and accountably. Republicans have been borrowing money from the people of Minnesota, from their kids and grandkids, in order to cover up their own political problems. And what all they're doing is creating real problems for people in future years. We know that the tobacco bonds are going to double the cost of the operating dollars we're using to keep the state operating. And this has never been done before in state history. It should never be done again. And we absolutely and completely oppose the use of this deficit scheme in order to balance the budget in this current budget and in any future budget.
Yeah, and I might briefly comment as the lead Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee. During the floor debate last spring, I raised many of the issues that Representative Winkler just outlined. This is one of the most expensive ways that you can finance the day-by-day operations of state government. The total principal is going to be about $757 million. The total interest, $459 million. So the total cost will be about $1.2 billion, and that was roughly the number that we used during the session when I spoke to the issue. And as Representative Winkler pointed out, and I would like to emphasize, this is the first time in the state's history that we've engaged in this kind of financing of state government. It's just a poor way to go. It's not addressing the needs of the state in an appropriate manner. And in my view, the founders of the state, when they talked about balanced budgets and deficit financing and the use of bonds, it was usually for long-term projects like funding our infrastructure and so on. So we continue to have a lot of concerns about this approach and continuing it. Guess we're open to questions, I guess.
This was your governor's bill that he signed. He signed off on the agreement. Did you try to dissuade him?
This was not. First of all, this was not the governor's bill. The use of tobacco, the use of tobacco bonds in Minnesota to balance the budget was first proposed by Tim Pawlenty in 2009. When Democrats were in the legislature, we rejected it. Governor Dayton signed into law a bill that included this appropriation bonds only after the longest shutdown in state history. He didn't do it on day 1. He didn't do it on day 10. He said the only way we could do it is because the harm being done to the state by the shutdown was worse than the long-term cost of these bonds. We don't have to do that again. We're not in that situation again. And just because there has to be one responsible adult at the state capitol to actually keep the government functioning doesn't mean that it's his bill.
Should the governor unequivocally rule this out? He has, in the last couple of weeks, said that he won't take it off the table even though it's not his preferred option.
The governor is the one negotiating with legislative Republicans. Whether he thinks it needs to be on the table as a negotiating point is up to him. But I think from our point of view, there is no reason that the legislature should ever again vote to use appropriation bonds. And frankly, from my own personal view, I'm not sure that there isn't a constitutional question about whether we're just creating a constitutional loophole and doing something that is absolutely opposed by the language which says we're supposed to balance our budgets.
Do you guys recall, did any Democrats vote for this in the House or the Senate?
No.
What would you propose as an alternative, assuming that we do have a deficit? Is it budget cuts, and if so, where?
The alternative we would propose is revenue raised fairly, and revenue raised from people who can most afford to pay it. This isn't a new story. The only thing that's new is that because Republicans couldn't get around this issue of revenue in any other way, they created this problem of actually creating revenue bonds. And so, you know, the battle lines, I guess, are not different. But what we've seen is it costs twice as much to do it. It's hard for any Republican to claim fiscal responsibility when they're borrowing money and paying twice as much. They're spending twice as much to get the same level of service as they would if they were raising revenue.
I would just add one bit here. These are securitization bonds, and they are the most expensive form of bond that you can issue. If you were to rank the bonds, you know, your general obligation bonds, full faith and credit that we use for infrastructure, appropriation bonds, which there's some real legal questions, and then the securitization bonds or the pledging of tobacco dollars. And that's not a steady source of income. The tobacco revenue does each year go up and down, and that's why the interest rate is that much more expensive on the securitization bonds. So it's the poorest bonding authority that you could issue.
Lynn, what are you hearing about the prospects of another deficit? And what's the size?
Well, the state economist, none of us know the size of it because that'll come out early December, but the state economist has publicly said that we will have a slower rate of growth than what was anticipated with the February forecast. Rule of thumb, roughly 1% less than what had been forecasted. Now, that will be finalized, of course, in December, but with a slower growth rate than anticipated, many of us feel that we are facing potentially a multi-million-dollar or hundreds of millions of dollars in potential shortfall. But we'll know the answer to that question early December.
Do you know what 1% growth equates to in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars that don't show up?
I haven't calculated that, but it would be very significant.
Is there room for any more cuts in the current budget?
Well, go ahead.
You can always cut more, but the question is, what are you doing to people's lives? Republicans passed their own budget at the end of May that cut 140,000 people off of health care in the state. So, yeah, you definitely could go down the path of additional budget cuts, but what you're talking about is cutting people off of health care, cutting further from schools, going after the things that are essential to the state's future and that a lot of people depend on. So it isn't just a matter of going out and finding some mythical spending cuts, which the same tax chair tried to do in order to pay down property tax increases that they've caused. There aren't just, you know, it's not like another cut to the Department of Waste, Fraud, and Abuse. We can cut more, but it's going to affect real people, and you're not asking anybody else who can better afford to pay to step up. So the answer to this has to be revenue, in one form or another. And in fact, I think it's interesting, even in Congress, Republicans were starting to acknowledge that revenue has to be part of the solution to the deficit. It's true in Washington, it's true in here. It has to be part of the solution, and if they're not willing to engage on that topic, we're going to end up in the same situation over and over again, where we are creating problems for ourselves. We are borrowing money, spending twice as much to get the same amount of service. It just doesn't make any sense.
How likely do you think it'll be that this latest deficit, as significant as kind of people are sort of estimating it'll be, will just ultimately end up in unallotments?
How likely is it that we end up in unallotments?
Yeah, I mean, how likely do you think it would be that legislators would just fail to make the necessary cuts? And
well, so far in the in the one-year history of this Republican legislature, the idea of doing something responsible and long-term and actually fixing the problem, their record isn't very good. So in the end, if it comes down to an unallotment, I guess is the answer. But the governor has a number of tools that he can use to help bring them to the table before that, and I think we're going to see it all play out long before we get to the point of the governor unilaterally cutting.
With 2012 being an election year, though, what are the chances of raising revenue, increasing taxes on anybody?
There are ways to raise revenue that aren't what you would call a tax increase. We can close tax loopholes. We could raise cigarette fees or alcohol fees. The whole public discussion we've had at the legislature, you've had, not I, but you've had about the Viking Stadium is about how to raise revenue for something. Where there's a will, there's certainly a way to do it. And Republicans might find that they're better off facing voters in their community without making cuts to schools and their hospital than they are by asking a few people in upper incomes to pay a little bit more in taxes.
But when Governor Pawlenty proposed a tobacco fee, you all called it a tax. So what are the chances of doing that again now?
I don't give a lot of credibility to the idea that Republicans are suddenly going to have a big change of heart on raising the income tax. It may be that the impact in their communities of further budget cuts convinces them that their own reelection depends on raising revenue and helping to fund some of the core services they need. That may be where the change of heart comes from.
And nobody can forget that taxes have been raised by the Republicans, and we've seen that with the property taxes of this year and property tax statements just going out. My personal example is my house valuation went down 18%, and my taxes went up 9%. And that's the story around throughout Minnesota because of the cuts that the Republicans made. And also the record number of school districts asking for property tax increases because we borrowed from school districts. So I think to say that the Republicans haven't raised taxes is inaccurate.
Let me get into the issue of the tobacco fee versus tobacco tax. You recall that issue ended up going to court, and the court decided that it was a tax because of the agreement that there would be no fee increases with the tobacco settlement thing.
I understand that, but I just said, do you think you can raise taxes in 2012? And he said, no, we're not going to raise taxes, we'll raise fees. But when the governor called it a fee, you guys called it a tax. That's all I'm getting at. It would be a tax.
Let me point out, there are certain things that people do believe you can raise. You can either call them fees or you can call them taxes, but the people who don't like to say that they're raising taxes can then call them fees, that the public is pretty supportive about raising the amounts on. So let's just talk about that. And tobacco is one, liquor is another one, and things like that.
And
so
the operative phrase that Ryan used, I think, is where there's a will. Where there's a will. It doesn't matter how you define a tax or fee. If there's a will to solve the problem, we can solve it.
Revenue.
With revenue.
Speaking of bonding of a different kind, Representative Hausman, are you getting any indications from the other side whether there's going to be any bonding bill of any size, given the...
Both the House and the Senate Capital Investment Committee are touring the state. I would assume that if they're touring the state looking at projects, that they assume to go forward with a bonding bill. I think the question would simply be the issue of size.
Do you know what the capacity is right now?
We'll know that as part of the forecast too, although the amount for this year is not likely to change. $775 million is built into the forecast, and MMB tells me that really won't change because that's for this year, and the forecast doesn't affect that. So $775 million is the amount built into the forecast.
The upper limit.
The upper limit.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you.
Representative Hausman, so much less of you.